My name's Jon Kolko. I'm a partner at Modernist Studio, which is a consultancy in Austin, Texas, in the United States. And before I start, I want to say my wife is here, and it's our 17th anniversary on Saturday. So thank you very much for putting up with me for so long. Okay, let's talk about creativity. Creativity seems like it's the new vogue, the new innovation. In fact, recently, Entrepreneur magazine had 5 creative ideas that lead to productivity. And in fact, Inc. magazine had 3 ways to foster creativity in your company. And not to be outdone, Forbes had 3 ways to foster creativity in your organization, and Fast Company had 5 ways to keep your team's creativity flowing, and they also had the 6 myths of creativity and 4 ways your office is crushing your creativity, and 10 tips for managing creative people, and the secret to creativity, and also 8 secrets to creativity. And if you're keeping track, that's 37 secrets. And we'll be learning all of them today. No, I'm just kidding, we won't do that. This is actually my favorite. Yellow is known as an optimistic color and can stimulate creativity, from Entrepreneur magazine, and they had an infographic that goes along with it that, in case you're curious, this is what yellow looks like. Designers and people who need to be creative for their job should have color integrated into their workspace. And I suppose the biggest takeaway of the talk then is that you should make things yellow. Right. I want to offer you 4 non-secrets on the path to creativity that I've learned dealing with large organizations who are trying to bring creativity into their organizations. We'll talk about the idea of acknowledging feelings. We'll speak a little bit about taming ambiguity. I'll talk some about letting them run amok, letting them run on their own, and then spend a little bit of time talking about driving a vision through your organization. And let's start with the idea of acknowledging feelings. Everyone is naturally creative. I think we've heard that over and over. I don't know if that's true. This grotesque thing is something I made when I was 6. It's actually part of a series. My mother still has them all. I think I was particularly prescient with this one because, I don't know, it certainly rings a bell in the United States. I think when most people think about creativity, they think about making something, and for a lot of us, making something is very, very energizing. It feels very good to sort of put our heart and soul into that thing, because we put everything we had into it. We put our spirit into it a little bit. And it was really hard for most of us to make. I think even no matter where we are in our career, making things is difficult, and part of the complexity and the interest is in that difficulty. Yet, I think that when we start to see a little bit about what we've made, and we kind of look around, and we see that everybody else made things too. And then something interesting happens, which is that we start to compare, and we say, well, the thing I made isn't necessarily as good as the thing they made. And then we internalize that a little bit more, and we start to think, well, my thing is bad. And then something interesting happens, and I've seen it primarily with junior designers and junior technologists, but I also see it in more senior folks as well, which is they start to see that they are bad. And it's an interesting translation there from the thing I made being so meaningful that they find themselves in it. And then one of 2 things seems to happen. For a lot of my staff, I've seen I give up. Maybe they literally give up, they quit, and they go, open a restaurant or something like that. Or maybe they figuratively give up. They still go to work and they just don't do a great job. The other thing that I've seen, though, is that people sometimes say, you know what, I will fight for what I made, because if I can convince you that what I made is good, then I can convince myself that what I made is good, and I can convince myself that I am good. And again, there's a translation there, and I think many of us then see combative staff at our jobs when we're in a leadership role. Because I think something like this happens. We make something, we go through a creative iteration, and there's critique, but that critique is aimed at myself. And that's problematic. I see that I am bad, but there's other ways to handle critique, and I think this is actually unique to the world of creativity. Evan Torchin, a friend of mine who's a design manager at Apple, said, in fact, it's unique to designers because I look at a bunch of nurses, and are they like, am I inserting this catheter right, and then beating themselves up about it for days? That seems to be a unique quality of those of us who are in creative fields. I think that we can actually fix that, and our first sort of non-secret is to shortcut self-critique with group critique, to actually formalize the idea of moving from iteration and critique into the idea of a group commentary. And that happens by fostering a formal meeting called a critique that emerges constraints. A constraint is the idea of something freeing, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but all of this then leads to more iteration, which ultimately then leads to a new idea. Group critique starts to formalize criticism of the artifact. It starts to remove that sense of self from the conversation. Judy Siegel, who's the director of UX at MSNBC Digital, talks about how central to critique is the idea of trust. I want to create an environment that's professionally safe for my staff. And that's an interesting thing, a word to choose for your workplace. I want it to be safe. I want it to be professionally safe. And so our second secret, or non-secret, is the idea of focusing on building trust as a design leader, as a creative leader, as much as you focus on building craft. I think we spend an awful lot of time in terms of professional development, having our team become better at their craft. Think about how you can help them become better at trust. I think about work this way. There's this idea of constraints and iteration and critique, and the work itself takes up some amount of time, but everything else takes up some amount of time as well. And I've seen that many organizations try to fill that outside time with almost like inspirational activities. We send people to training, but we also try to do things in that almost 70% of time to help them feel better about themselves. And one of the things that I've seen happen over and over is we put people on these blue sky projects, these greenfield ideas that never seem to go anywhere, but they're trying to be inspirational for our designers. But when I talked to Mike Kruzaneski, he's a design manager at Twitter, he said instead of taking someone and putting them on this what-if project, have them go work on a book. Have them create a book about the studio, about themselves, about their team, and about their work. Because who doesn't like having a book with pictures of yourself on it? Engage your team in this idea of being creative about themselves. And I can echo that sentiment because I put myself on the cover of my first book. Anyway, that's an aside. The next sort of non-secret there is to build trust by filling that 70% of time, all of this other nonsense that happens at work, by having the team make something about the team. Because that starts to build trust across all of your designers on your creative team. Okay, so our first idea here is acknowledging feelings. Let's talk a little bit about taming ambiguity. I think at the beginning of a design problem, in fact, all the way through a creative problem, there's this sense of just like overwhelmingness. And this is the idea, this sort of like, what's going to happen? Am I going to do it right? I don't know what's going to happen next. How do you know it will work? I've heard that over and over from stakeholders and clients. How do you know it will work, right? What are the requirements? I don't know if you're sick and tired of hearing that, but I certainly am. This is one of my favorite ones that comes from clients. What's our cloud strategy? And you're like, you don't know what you're talking about at all. And then you're like, oh my God, I'm just so overwhelmed. Okay? I think we can work our way through that ambiguity by making something. I spoke with my friend Kevin McDonald. He's a partner at Argo Design, which is a consultancy in Austin. And he says an artifact gives us a framework for having a conversation about ideas. It's a negotiation. I like that very much. It's this idea of beginning a conversation or, in many respects, driving toward some sort of agreement. The artifact starts that. If we come back to this idea of constraints, iteration, and critique, the iteration unlocks all of the conversation that follows. Making something becomes the most important thing, even if that something is nothing, because then it starts this process of forward momentum. And so I think, again, one of the non-secrets for a design leader is to make the first thing yourself in order to help the team tame ambiguity. That changes the idea of what a creative director does. I think most of us who are in leadership roles are like, I'm not touching the software anymore. You guys go do it. I'll be like the yay team on the side and manage all of the stakeholders. But in fact, one of the things you can do to help build that trust, but also jumpstart the process, is make something. And in fact, if it's terrible, that's just fine. It starts that whole iterative cycle. This idea of constraints becomes really important too. A constraint emerges from the work itself. It's this idea of an unexpected discovery over the course of a project. My friend Ben Fullerton, who's was a design director at Nike, talks about how the requirements, those are onerous. They're these edicts that are pushed down on top of us. But this idea of a constraint emerges from the creative process itself. And we can draw that all the way back to Charles and Ray Eames, who spoke a great deal about how the power of of constraints leads them to create, in their case, beautiful furniture like this. Understanding the limitations. Charles Eames describes that here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem. The ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, and their willingness and enthusiasm for working within the constraints. Again, the design leader can start to articulate, this is the problem we are trying to solve. And this actually becomes one of the most important phrases that I use when I'm trying to help my team see their way forward. In many times, we actually write it in big letters on the wall. The problem we are trying to solve is, and it's not static. It's something that we change throughout the entirety of the process. This is the problem we are trying to solve begins to tame that ambiguity because it adds a frame around the problem. So help your team start to see and articulate the constraints to help them frame the problem. I'd like to move on to one of my favorite, the idea of letting them run amok, your team, letting them run crazy and wild. This is a picture from my former studio, and that's a band playing as loud as possible in the studio. Our neighbors in other studios came in and said, that's the loudest thing we've ever heard. You need to stop that right away. That was a band brought in for one of our staff members' birthdays. This is a button board that one of my staff designed. It's based on Arduinos, and when you press one of the buttons, you hear a variety of different noises played all over the studio. Different excerpts from videos, okay? Very loud, very obnoxious. This is one of my designers, hard at work. This is how you make coffee in our office. This is what happens when people are too cold in the studio. They take the thermostat off the wall. I'm showing you these things not to point out how wacky and crazy my studio is, but instead to start to show you an indication of what happens when you have freedom. When you have the freedom to control your environment, both your physical environment and your procedural environment. We have this idea of constraints, iteration, and critique, and freedom comes from the idea of passion and drive, okay? And they lead to one another. Inspiration leads to freedom, and freedom leads to inspiration. But when we have rules, just the opposite occurs. Great ideas bounce off. And when I talk about rules, I don't just mean rules coming from the business owners. This idea of the requirements that we talked about, those onerous edicts. I mean the rules that are coming from the organization itself. In many organizations, you're literally not allowed to put things on the wall. Right? You can't have a critique because you're not allowed to put artifacts in the space. You can't move your space around. That sends a signal to your employees. It says, don't experiment. If you're not allowed to experiment with the physical space, why would you be allowed to experiment in your work itself? Rules, unlike constraints, destroy creativity. You might think to yourself, well, actually, the business I'm in literally will not let me do those things. Maybe that's an opportunity to reevaluate if that's the business you want to be in. Because if the business prioritizes facilities management over creativity, that sends a message about how innovative you may or may not be able to be. When I talked to Mike Elbers, he was one of the design leads in the BBC. He said, we were designing the embedded media player, and we decided to see how porn sites handle media playback. He said, what better a place to look at video than what the porn industry has done? So we blurred all the people, and we did a pinup on the wall. What he didn't realize is when you stepped back, all of the blurring sort of became nothing, and you could see everything. Okay? This idea of doing things rather than having to ask permission to do things, because if he told his leaders at the BBC he was going to print out porn and put it on the wall, he would probably have gotten fired just for asking. There are consequences when you start to break the rules, and as a creative leader, you need to be aware that you're going to make magic, but you're going to break a lot of glass. When one of my staff removed that thermostat, this is the email that I got from the head of the building that said, I was in the office again, and I saw the thermostat cover is missing again. Stop taking it off. I've reported this to your manager. There are consequences if you allow that freedom. And as a design leader, you get to own those consequences. In fact, you have to. Because if your staff starts to see you taking responsibility for them exploring, they know that they have a block. And it's a positive block. They have someone guarding them. And they're allowed to start to explore. Okay, that's the idea of letting them run amok. I think the most important message I'd like to talk through today is the idea of driving a vision. And when I talk about vision, commonly I hear things like, but I'm not Steve Jobs. I don't have a vision. Right? I don't have this like idealized view of the world. Having a vision doesn't mean you have the answer. It doesn't mean that you know everything. And in fact, just the opposite. I think it means that you become the shepherd of that. I want to give you an example through a mini case study. I was the vice president of design at a company called Blackboard. I was at a small startup, 20 people, that was acquired by Blackboard, a 3,000 person education company. And you can imagine the culture clash there with someone like me sort of running loose and lean at a 20-person startup, all of a sudden in charge at this sort of very stodgy organization. I want to share with you a little bit about what the path forward looked like there. And the first big idea is to give your team a reason to go to work. I'll do this by setting the stage a little bit for what education looks like in the United States. In fact, this is how much education costs in the United States. We have this idea of a in-state state school where tuition's much lower. In this case, much lower means $35,000 US. And if you go to a private institution, it's going to cost $120,000 US, which is extraordinary. It's compounded by the idea that you actually can't bankrupt out of the debt that you're going to acquire. And to give you a sense of what that debt might be, here's a point of reference. Instead of going to school, you could buy yourself a Tesla Model S and save a lot of money. But in fact, the problem's a little bit deeper than that, because in the US, only 59% of students actually graduate. And so they start to rack up that debt because it's so expensive, and then they don't actually finish. They're stuck with debt with no degree. What happens now is we actually start to track a 6-year graduation rate rather than a 4-year, and that means that the amount of money you're spending is even more. And so there's clearly a problem here, because if you contextualize that, you could go buy yourself a house in the Bahamas for less than it would cost to graduate with a degree in the United States. Point of reference, maybe we should actually encourage our kids to just go do that and have a great life. When we talked to students at Blackboard, Sarah, one of the students we talked to, said there's a page in her financial aid statement that explains how your student loans would be forgiven, and the only thing it said is if you die. It didn't make me feel great. We spend a lot of time with students. In fact, we would spend 3 to 4 hours in a session with an individual student trying to understand what it was like to be 18. Right? It's been a long time since I was 18, and this started to build empathy with them. And these are the types of things we heard. They don't see a path to completion. They don't understand how what they started when they were a freshman actually matters when they're a senior. They start with psychology because maybe their parents were psychologists, and then they get to be a senior and they say, I hate psychology, but I'm stuck because, again, I racked up $120,000 in debt. I should probably continue with that pathway. And as a result, they feel alone. They feel anxiety. There's just this massive burden that's pulling down on undergraduates in the United States. We arrived at our opportunity statement. Remember, I talked about this idea of setting the problem statement. There's an opportunity to help students identify their interests, graduate on time, and get a job. Because if we can do this, we can help them better contextualize why that debt is actually maybe useful, and why they should maybe stick with their degree, even if it's not something that they loved. When we talked about this idea of showing them the data, Ivo Stavorak, a friend of mine who's on the senior leadership team at Google X, said, show them the data because that shows them a reason to believe. And the data that I just shared with you is the data. We talked about Sarah and her quote about having her student loans forgiven. And we talked about this idea of the quantitative statistics around what it costs in the US. That's the data. And when I tell my teams that over and over and over, it helps them realize the vision that we're starting to build around where we're going with the products that we build. And so I think our next non-secret there is to use real data to actually reinforce why the work they're doing matters. Why should they go to work every single day? And in this case, it's because we want to help Sarah, and we want to help those students who are so far in debt. The next idea around this drive of vision is to constantly tell the retrospective story. And I'll do that actually by finishing and sort of walking through this case study, but a little bit backwards. What you're seeing here is the Personal Education Planner. It's a product that we developed at Blackboard right before I left. And it's a simple product that helps college students identify their interests, start to understand what degrees and opportunities are available, and then what jobs emerge as a result of completing those degrees. And what we found through our research is that 18-year-olds actually have no idea what they want to do, not surprisingly, because remember back to when you were 18 and probably you had other things on your mind. And so this tool was intended to help them, before they picked a major or a degree that they ultimately would hate, identify a better path forward. Let me talk a little bit about how we got to this value promise. We promise to empower students to take control of their educational experience. And where this started was through this idea of iteration. Our first iteration looked something like this. Remember I talked about how I was at a startup. The startup was called MyEDU. And this was one of the core products we had. We helped college students plan their schedule. A huge amount of students in the United States are now what's called non-traditional. And that means they're not 18 years old. They might be 35 or 36. They're going back to school. They might have children. They might work more than one job. They might go to more than one school. And so they have a hard time managing their lives. And when we think about our lives, we live by the calendar, right? Outlook or Google. But an 18-year-old or a 35-year-old who's never had a professional job doesn't know what it's like to follow an Outlook schedule. And so we gave them a very simple way to build their calendar. And we made it a little bit more advanced because when they're selecting their courses, they could see the teachers, the professors that are teaching those individual sections. And what's more, they could start to identify the type of teacher it is, going all the way to how they grade. And we've talked a little bit at the conference about the idea of predictive analytics. We had so much raw data that we could actually start to predict with some degree of statistical significance if their grading style was going to get harder or easier. And so when you picked a class, you could say, well, you know what? I need an easy A. We tried not to encourage that. Instead, what we found was that students would pick the harder classes. They wanted a challenge, and so they look through the different professors and actually start to take the ones that maybe were a little bit harder and maybe a little bit more aggressive in their grading. We could also look at things like course statistics, like how many people get certain grades, and we could give them the distribution. Okay, so this was our first product, this idea of a schedule planner with a little bit more smarts to it. From there, we started to build out this idea of a profile, because if we understood what our 2 million-ish college students were doing, we could help them articulate to other people what they were doing. And this, what emerged from this was our second product. And this is an idea of a profile, very much like LinkedIn, but highly visual and catered specifically to a college student. If you remember, if you think about your LinkedIn profile, pretty rich and exciting, and then remember what it was like to be a college student, you had nothing to put on it. It said like started school, and that was it. And when we talk to students, they'd say, I hate LinkedIn. It makes me feel so dumb. And it makes them feel dumb because they haven't done anything yet. We tried to highlight what they had done. Maybe they were the president of their fraternity, or they were a starting baseball player on their team. These are things that show leadership skills, and they show commitment. And so we gave them a way to highlight those things rather than just the careers they've taken and the different jobs and internships they've arrived at. And so this was our second idea of a profile, and based on that profile, we could start to recommend jobs to them. And this became our business model. We would take student data and sell it to college recruiters who could hire them. And so the recruiters could sort of mine through the data, and the students could mine through jobs, and they could identify places where maybe they want to live. We gave them some basic statistics about the places in typical startup fashion. We just made those up, but that's what you do in a loose and lean environment like a startup. And so over time, it started to emerge sort of a third product direction, this idea of careers, matching careers with students. And we tried this little mini product as maybe our fourth-ish iteration. This was the idea of helping students understand, like, what do I even want to do? I don't even know where to start. We gave them a very simple selector for, well, what's most important to you? I just want to make a lot of money. Okay, well, then pick the money thing. All right, so you pick money, and maybe you start to see different opportunities. In this case, this is sort of a one-up view of a career opportunity. It's a nurse. Well, what does it mean to be a nurse in the United States? Well, here's the different things you'll be doing. There's videos of nurses talking about their experiences. There's upsides and downsides. Again, we just made those up because it's a startup. There's a cost of living calculator. What does it mean to live like a nurse? And if you look at that, actually, we can start to help you understand what you'll be able to afford. And so students could say things like, well, I want to drive a Lamborghini, and I want to live in LA, and by the way, I want to be a dancer. And we could say, well, that's probably not going to work. maybe you want to reevaluate some of those choices. And we would give them things like, how do I translate a salary into an hourly wage, because they're used to hourly. Right? They don't know what $50,000 or $60,000 a year means. They know what $18 an hour means. And so we would help them start to make that translation. Again, the next iteration on our track toward that education planner, here's the education planner that we ended up shipping. Students were able to identify their passions, and you could start to see little glimpses of, maybe we stole this from at iteration 4. And they could start to say, well, these are things I'm interested in, even though I don't know career paths that are related with this. And we could build a plan just for them. They could start to discover the different options and opportunities that are available to them. And they could start to look through things like careers, or they could look at people, alumni that went to the university that they graduated from. They could look at related programs. Maybe they could find the skills that they might need in order to get that particular degree or that particular plan. In this case, maybe they tapped on SQL. Well, if I learn SQL, what is it going to be like to get a job? Well, we can start to identify, hey, there's high demand for that, particularly in New York City. And so if you wanted to end up in that area, you'd be able to focus on that. And then what are, again, some degree plans or majors that I'll be able to use in order to learn those skills? We can do things like show videos of, speaking with an alumni. The idea of a personal education plan emerged over that period of time. When I talked to Rachel Hinman, who was at Trulia, she said, the tricky part of being a leader is you have to get people to follow you. You have to get people to support your ideas and values you're trying to move forward. I just told you a story in a very persuasive way about how we went from this to this to this to this to this and launched this awesome product. And that's how I get people to follow me. And it's total bullshit. It was not that easy, and it was not that beautiful, and this didn't lead to this, lead to this, lead to this. It was a mess. We tried this, and it didn't work, and we went over there, and that didn't work, and we had to iterate on this, and there was chaos over here. But I told it to you perfectly, because that's the way that you start to charge people so they're excited and they want to follow you. It's not a lie, it's selective, but it drives enthusiasm. And so our next big sort of non-secret there is this idea of making the story seem perfect, of getting in the habit and the ability to get your teams so jazzed about what you're doing by telling them a story of perfection. And when you combine that with the idea of showing them why the work matters, you start to drive a vision, and it doesn't mean you have the answer. It means you're setting the character, the tenor of what it means to follow that pathway. And so today we talked about 4 different areas. We talked about this idea of acknowledging feelings and recognizing that design and creativity is actually highly emotive. We talked about this notion of taming ambiguity and sort of the crazy that comes with a design problem, and then how you can actually serve as a leader to make sense of that. We talked about letting your teams run crazy, not just so that they're crazy, but so that you send a message that exploration and innovation and trying things that are a little bit risky is okay. And then we talked about this idea of driving a vision. We talked about how a vision doesn't mean you have the answer. I liked the idea of Fast Company driving all of these 10 secrets to that and 12 secrets to that. So I put myself on the cover of Fast Company along with my grotesque sculpture. Here's 12 ways to manage creativity. This is really what we talked about today, and these are the things I'd like to leave you with. When you acknowledge feelings, we can do that by holding group critiques, by bringing people together and aiming our criticism at their work instead of at them. We can build trust, and we can start to make team artifacts, stories about the team, rather than these vision what-if projects. We can make things in order to start to tame ambiguity, and as a leader, we can make the first thing. Okay? We can frame problems. We can articulate the constraints around the problem. When we talk about this idea of running amok in the business place, let them play. Let your team play. Remove hierarchy and remove rules, but ultimately you have to own the consequences of those decisions. And then finally, this idea of driving a vision. Driving a vision is really about describing the intent and the impact. It's about framing the strategy, and fundamentally, it's about telling that story of perfection, that path forward. I hope this will be useful as design leaders. You bring this into your organizations and really help your teams perform. Ultimately, it's about creative clarity. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Wow, amazing talk. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you.
Yeah, inspiring, I'd even say. Let's move right on to questions from the audience. No. Okay, then for now, I was very curious. In the running amok part, is something I like to do myself, and like you showed, at times this has consequences, and somebody gets a little pissed off. I'm very curious, as a supportive leader, they end up at you and they say, we can't have this any longer, this is madness. How do you support your team to make sure they can keep run amok and at the same time managing the people?
Yeah, you act as the filter, yeah? And so ideally, my team never knows.
Right.
First, I internalize it. I keep the wall up so that nobody really understands that they're being threatened. And then second, I need to own that, which means that I need to bear it. And so if I allow my team to do these things, it's on me to take the punishment. If you play that to its logical conclusion, you may get fired. I mean, it sucks to say, but in fact, that may be the repercussions for allowing your team to do these things. And again, sort of in an existential way, I would go, well, what am I here for? And am I here to work at a company and to build products and to build services in the context of that stifling environment, which maybe leads to appropriate but maybe very conservative and not exciting stuff? Or do I want to really blaze a trail? And do I want to drive impact? And do I want to drive innovation? And so like the big question mark at the end of that is, am I okay ultimately being fired, knowing I can get another job, but in a place that has this sort of atmosphere that allows for creative exploration?
All right. I still don't see any questions on the message board.
Great.
Then a last opportunity for the audience to maybe ask something.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you. Thank you.